Hey everyone, how are we all doing today? Welcome back to another episode of Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. My name's Al Horner, and we are what we survive. That's the message of Expats, the incredibly powerful new limited series from our guest this week, Lulu Wang. Lulu is a writer-director whose stories are unflinchingly intimate portraits of characters captivatingly full of contradictions. In this new show, adapted from a novel by Janice Y.K, those characters are three women, different in age, class, and relationship to motherhood, who become linked by the most unthinkable tragedy. In the aftermath of that disaster, these women's stories combine to tell a tale of grief and privilege in a modern-day Hong Kong battered by typhoon weather and simmering political dissent. It really is a remarkable show, the sort of TV that you walk away from not just moved, not just entertained, but perhaps a more empathetic person, which is basically the highest compliment I can give it. On today's episode, Lulu and I have a conversation about expats, which in turn is a conversation about impermanence and letting go. Lulu is of course the writer-director of 2019's The Farewell, based on a radio story that she wrote in 2016 for This American Life about her own Chinese-American immigrant family. In making this follow-up to that breakout hit, she broke a ton of rules and defied a ton of expectations. Expats from the outset sounds like some kind of thriller. Nicole Kidman plays Margaret, an American living in Hong Kong, whose youngest son disappears at a night market. Instead of that premise giving birth to a pulse-pounding pursuit full of cops, clues, and criminals, like most abduction dramas, Expats instead unfolds at a meditative pace, against the backdrop of the 2014 Umbrella Movement protests in Hong Kong, juxtaposing Margaret's feelings of hopelessness with a city undergoing the churn of change. In the spoiler conversation that you're about to hear, celebrating the magnificent finale that dropped today, Lulu and I talk about what happened to Gus and why the show refused to give an explanation for his disappearance, instead prioritizing what it means to grieve, how grief doesn't shrink, instead leaving us to grow around it. It's a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much to Lulu for being a delight to talk with, and a big thanks also to our Patreon supporters for helping make this show possible. If you like what we do on Script Apart and want to help the show continue to put episodes in your podcast feed, head to patreon.com/scriptapart, where for the price of a single monthly cup of coffee, you'll get all sorts of perks, including the chance to ask your questions to upcoming guests. That address one more time in case you're interested, it's patreon.com/scriptapart. Okay, that's all the admin out of the way, let's get into it. This is the incredible Lulu Wang discussing the first draft secrets of Expats, a series that absolutely floored me, and especially its incredible 5th episode. Thanks everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, with production as ever by Camille Demek. Lulu, welcome to Script Apart. Thank you for coming on the show, and thank you for Expats. This is a show that I found profoundly moving. There's a line in the final episode, Lulu. You can't discover new lands without courage to lose sight of the shore. And I've been thinking about that line so much, and I wanted to begin by asking about the courage that it took to take on a story of this magnitude. You know, it's a story that obviously required so much convention breaking to tell, and in turn took audiences to new places in terms of TV storytelling. So yeah, let's begin there. You've discussed being initially kind of intimidated by the scale and the responsibility of Janice's novel. Was it ultimately a variation of that line, you can't discover new lands without courage to lose sight of the shore, that convinced you to take the risk?
That is such a beautiful question, Alan. First of all, thank you so much for having me on. I'm a fan, so I'm really honored to be here. Um, it's funny, of all the lines in the show, that one in particular is extremely personal, because it's what got me through many, many years of not knowing if I was going to have a career in this industry. It was before I made The Farewell, and I had made another feature that didn't set up my career the way that I was hoping. And um, I'd gone through a breakup. I was in my 30s, so it was this moment of like, what's gonna happen? Should I got a lot of pressure. I had gotten accepted to law school when I graduated college, like go back there, or, is there anything else that you can do? And, everybody's buying houses and getting married and moving on with their lives. And I had that quote up and I just kept this image. My parents and I are immigrants from China. So I had this image of being very alone, but tried to imagine that I was in a boat in the middle of the ocean. And I just knew that I had come too far to go back, but that I just hadn't seen new land yet. And I had to keep going. And it's the image and the quote that I give to all my friends who are in the middle of a transition, trying to take on something new. And so, yeah, I think it's something that I carry with me in everything that I do, um, as a way to recognize when I'm in transition, when I'm trying to take a leap of faith, right? When you're trying to pioneer something, um, personal, professional. Um, so yeah, I don't think it was conscious on this show, but because of the risk that I took in doing the farewell, and then, how surprising it was that it actually landed with audiences, I just knew that I had to keep expanding and keep taking risks creatively. So yeah, the book was very daunting because of it being in Hong Kong and so many characters, and Hong Kong has changed so much also, and it means so much to so many people. And I was like, do I have the right to tell that story? Do I know enough to tell that story? I was incredibly humbled. And so I think that ultimately I just had to dive in. Like sometimes you can't know everything, but the humility to know that you don't know everything, and the humility to know that you might be in the middle of the ocean with no land in sight. And there were certainly many moments in the middle of this production where I felt that way. Um, and that kind of feeling of like I've come too far, and you know, I have to have faith that the land will show up somewhere in front of me.
That's so beautiful. And you mentioned The Farewell there, which is a film I adore. I think people assume that in adaptation, there's some kind of remove between the filmmaker and that project they're adapting when compared to a project like The Farewell, which, obviously was written from a very personal place. You were taking, your own experience of straddling two cultures and you were funneling it into this story. In my experience, though, kind of talking to filmmakers, adaptations can be just as personal as those stories that come from an immediately personal place. Just because you're working from someone else's source material, that doesn't mean that you're not weaving in your own past, your own fears, your own wants and desires. Was that the case for you here, Lulu? I know that you were working from Janice's fantastic novel and that you had a writer's room on this occasion, so it wasn't quite as solitary as it has been in the past. But yeah, talk me through how personal it felt to tell this story. It certainly feels intensely personal to watch.
Yes, it was very personal on many levels. I've always felt very deeply connected to Hong Kong because my family left Beijing in 1989, and a lot of the socio-political happenings, were repeated and reflected in my own experience from my in Hong Kong of my own experiences. Um, and I left when I was 6. So there's something very meaningful when things happen when you're that age, because you're starting to have a sense of the world. I have these memories, and I felt like a person, not just like a kid, but at the same time, you're still quite young and you are a kid. But then I was also dealing with my own personal transition, like having to move to America and leave all my family behind and learn a new language. And so, seeing, all of the things that have happened in Hong Kong, mirror my experience, I've just felt that connection to the people there and that place. And then, of course, the show is about female friendship and female rage and grief and family and community and diaspora. What does home really mean as somebody who has lived in multiple places, and I have a hard time identifying where my true home is. I really connected to that, the ability to create a really intense community in a short period of time. And then because people are transient when you're not of that place, people do go home. Uh, then you lose that friendship. And what do you do with that? Like, and the intensity in such a short period of time versus friendships that you might build back home that last for much longer. Um, and then, also you're making friends and having experiences that you wouldn't normally have in your place of comfort, in your comfort zone, right? Um, and so that's what really drew me to telling that story.
And you touched upon there the things that this story is about. And it was a long list because this is a show that contains kind of this multitude of themes and multitude of subjects. You could have made a 6-part TV series about one woman's sorrow and her recovery after kind of experiencing pretty much the most harrowing thing a parent can go through, losing a child. That would have sustained a 6-part TV series. You could have also have made like a 6-part TV series about privilege and class in modern day Hong Kong. The fact that Expats manages to kind of tell both of those stories and more simultaneously in such an elegant way, finding the kind of intersection between all of those things, that's really special, Lulu. Can you tell me about that intersection? Like, what was the connective tissue between the kind of personal and the political, that kind of was so inviting to you and perhaps even so necessary?
Well, I think that, oftentimes a lot of topics feel very binary, when we talk about, particularly in this country, if we're talking about diversity, it becomes very binary. And I really, in taking on this world that is quite global, quite international, quite a microcosm of the world, it just felt like it needed to be the intersection of so many things. And I think that was also what was daunting. It's like, well, if you're saying this is true, can that also be true? Right? And how do you tackle a show? And I don't know that, like, film, this is my first foray into television, and what I love about TV is that it feels like a novel but also like an album, in a way. And you can have the single, but you can, have um you can have collaborations, right? Within each track. And so that's kind of how I tackled it, was like, yes, this is about a woman's grief, but there's many perspectives to it. And yes, her grief is real, but can she also be a bad person sometimes? Can she behave badly? And um can different people feel differently about it? Like, is it justified? Is it not justified? Are any of us justified in our behavior if we're experiencing a difficult time in our lives? And that applies to all of the characters that does, when we reveal what's going on for somebody, does that suddenly justify the behavior that you've been seeing in previous episodes? And so, yeah, I really saw it as like peeling back an onion, that it's not a story where you're just being fed, like, this is what happens and then this happens. It's not a plot driven type story. There's lots of plot in there, don't get me wrong, but I wanted it to feel layered and complex and nuanced.
I love the piano analogy, especially knowing that, you came from a musical background, you were a pianist. I also love what you mentioned there about sort of, I guess, the sort of way that the show doesn't necessarily prioritize plot in the way that we might typically expect from a kind of missing persons story. This is a very different type of missing kid narrative to the ones that typically as an audience we get. You might read the logline for Expats and expect this to be a crime thriller about an abducted child and the race against time to find them. typically in these types of stories, there are kind of suspect characters from within the parents' orbit, and typically there's a resolution as well, some kind of clarity by the end of the story about what exactly happened to the missing kid. And often it's the case that the kid comes back, they find them. Expats is not that TV show. Instead, by the end of the 6 episodes, we don't find out what happened to Gus. And instead, as the show kind of progresses, it reveals itself to be more a story about acceptance. There's a beautiful line in the final episode, in fact, literally in the closing moments of the show, that I think Mercy says about, holding the pain and keeping on living. And it seems like that's the kind of thematic conclusion of the story. Can you tell me what was so intriguing and perhaps even theoretically useful to audiences about, not making this a whodunit and not prioritizing plot and giving a resolution about what happened to Gus and making that the thrust of the story, and instead turning it into, as I say, a story about acceptance and learning to control the things that you can control in a sometimes senseless world?
That's beautifully put, and so spot on. Yeah, I think there's so many whodunits, and I love them. I watch them, and they're beautifully done. The good ones, at least, I really love. Um, but I don't know if it was also influenced by making it during the pandemic, or just also experiencing my own losses, but we don't have the answers. I think so many people in the world are grappling with loss of all kinds, literal loss, but also ambiguous loss, the loss of an identity, the loss of somebody that you never got to say goodbye to. Um, and, I think I saw this quote where it said that as time goes on, grief doesn't go away, but we have to expand around the grief. Sorry, it's the quote is that the grief doesn't shrink, but instead it becomes smaller because we grow and we expand around the grief and we carry on. And I thought that was really beautiful. And so I think that that's what this show is about, in ways in which um, people can be and are resilient. Um, and particularly these women, because so often women aren't given um, space in the world, and women's pain and rage and grief aren't what dominate the conversation in the mainstream. And so I wanted to give a space for all of those feelings and for hope. Like, I didn't want the film to be, I mean, it was one of the first things Nicole asked of me. She was like, the farewell is so funny and heartbreaking. If anybody can make this show funny, it's you. Go make it funny. I was like, oh God, oh, like, no pressure, like this show about a woman losing her kid. Go make it funny. But I wanted it to be light in moments as well, and just show people as people.
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't just show the 3 main characters as people. We of course have episode 5, Central, which I guess by the album analogy is kind of it's kind of the show's Bohemian Rhapsody, just in terms of length and expansiveness, right? So that episode is one of my favorite episodes of TV in a long time. Although, of course, it really stretches the definition of what TV is, in terms of length and the way it kind of zooms out to tell different stories, involving different characters outside the bubble of these 3 main women. I love this episode not just because it kind of introduces these incredible new characters while maybe illuminating a flaw or two in the more privileged characters that we've already given our compassion to. I think I love it most because between the political protests that we get a glimpse at, and of course the typhoon that this episode occurs against a backdrop of, there's such a sense of change in the air in that entire episode that, I think speaks to the show's kind of wider sense of impermanence, right? Expats are by their very nature kind of impermanent. Can you tell me about like yeah, the ambitious move of throwing an episode like Central into this story at the point in the season in which it appears? It's such a masterstroke. It's so ambitious. Tell me everything, Lulu.
It was the first thing that I pitched, actually, like in saying the only way I'll do this show, I said, was if I get to make this episode. I think I just felt like in creating a world that was about a privileged bubble, I had to take the audience and myself outside of that bubble in order to challenge the bubble, to like have a perspective on it, to step outside of it, to understand the context of that bubble. Because otherwise, how do you portray a bubble while just being in it? It's sort of like if you're making a show about wealth and privilege, how do you show it without it feeling like you're also living in it and indulging in it? And that was like the challenge for me of like, well, we're spending all this time in this bubble. Like, are we aligning ourselves with it? But I also don't want to like come at it from a judgmental point of view, right? Because regardless of class and money and privilege, like you have to sympathize with the characters that you're portraying. And so this was my way of creating a juxtaposition. And also, I thought, it was be really refreshing. Like episode 4 is the bottle episode where everybody's trapped. So it's very interior. And then episode 5, it felt like we needed to break open. And it also just felt like I needed to upend everything in some way before we go to the finale, because it's not, as we said earlier, a plot driven show. So where do you go after all of that devastation? At the end of 4, it is a heavy episode. The characters go through a lot in it. And so where do you go but, a rendition of Katy Perry's Roar in the Rain. Right? And also I think from like just from a filmmaking perspective, as so many of the films that I adore were made in a period where of time where the studios were making films of this size and sort of um uh yeah, just of the size and budget level, that weren't necessarily like a franchise or star driven. So it also felt like an opportunity, because where else would I get the opportunity to do something of this scale that centers not well-known actors, at least in the United States, but also get to have Nicole Kidman, but as a supporting role, and also get to deal with politics and all of these, so I just felt like an opportunity to take these resources and channel it into something that would be impossible to make under any other circumstance.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that. I did find myself thinking during those typhoon scenes, which you brought to life so incredibly, I want to watch a Lulu Wang disaster movie. That was not a sentence that was on my mind until now, but here it is.
And I would make one. I would definitely make one. I don't know that people think of me for things like that, but I would be very excited to do that.
Let's make it happen. So, we've been talking about the things that you were kind of creating and what you were pitching. I am curious, like, I haven't read the book yet, unfortunately. So I should ask about, like, yeah, what you inherited versus what you created from scratch when we talk about these characters and some of the different elements of each episode. Like, can you give us an overview on what was in the source material versus either what you opted to change or what you opted to add?
Yeah, so much was in the book that I just loved. Like Janice Y.K. Lee is the author of the novel, and I also got her into the writer's room.
She wrote the final episode. Is that correct?
She did write the final episode, but we all broke those episodes together, and it was incredibly beautiful collaborative experience. And Janice was the one who kept being like, "Stop copying the book, like, let's, like, like, I don't need to recreate the book, and we can, like, expand on it and change it entirely. She was so not precious about it, and we would always go back to it as a blueprint, as the DNA, because, um, like everything, when you first read it there and something strikes you, like, that's what you have to hold on to when you're working, because it's so easy to just kind of, like, go off track, and you get all these notes, and people turn into this other thing. And so I always, keep, like, a notebook of just specific things that was the genesis of why I wanted to make the movie or the series. And I do that on even projects I don't adapt. It's like I had these dreams about scenes, and I would write that down, and so you always go back to that, right? To make sure you're holding on to the tone. And so, we would always go back to the book, and Mercy, Margaret, were incredibly well fleshed out, like, their dynamics, Mercy's curse, this, like, sense that there's something quite internally dark about this character that she can't escape, that comes from generational trauma. Um, and then, Margaret's sense of privilege combined with her grief makes her just this very complicated character. The fact that she doesn't want to be like another American expat who behaves badly towards the locals, but then, uh, grief kind of brings out the worst in her. And I really, love seeing that hypocrisy. Um, and then, other things that we changed were, we just really wanted to expand on the Hillary character. And it was important for us to show a woman who didn't want to have children. And in the novel, she also really wanted to have a child and couldn't. And so she ended up adopting. And it just didn't feel true to me that, like, every woman in the story had to be in relation to being a mother somehow. And so we changed Hillary, in that, she was somebody who was struggling with how to, be honest with both her husband and her best friend about the fact that she didn't want to have children, and also her mother, right? And the weight and the pressure that she was facing. We also changed her, ethnic cultural background. She was white British in the novel, and, we've made her Indian American, Sikh in particular, because the writer that was we were working with, Simran Santu, who's incredible, incredible, had all of these personal stories about her own Sikh, background, that she brought to the script. Um, and then we also changed things, like Charlie in the book is a boy, we made Charlie a girl, and then also expanded a lot on the politics as well as the, helpers. The helpers, Essie and Puri, were in this, novel, but they weren't really centered, and so I found that their story so interesting, and, wanted to expand. So I actually said to Janice, like, "If you were to take these characters and expand on them, write a whole 'nother novel, where could we go?" And so then we started doing research on, the, you know, plight of domestic workers in Hong Kong. Yeah, and obviously the political situation was not in the book.
Was it always structured the same way in terms of the ending? Because, the show is about, at first glance, these two women who are kind of linked by this terrible tragedy. And, they have to go on this journey towards being ready to say all the things they need to say to each other. In the first episode, neither character's really ready for that. There's this kind of chance encounter that leads to both of them being in each other's proximity, and then they each have their own individual spirals. And it's so fraught with emotion and blame, that kind of first near miss. By the final episode, they're able to resolve things in this kind of beautiful way, in this conversation in which they are able to say the things they need to say. There's no kind of miracle that permits a reset, to quote Mercy, but they are each able to find some kind of letting go. Was that always the journey from start to finish that the show needed to go on, the kind of circularity that you were going to achieve from first episode to last?
Yeah, I mean, that always felt like, the resolution to me, that it's, it's not an external plot resolution, but one in which when I say we, I mean the characters, but also we as people, right? Like we have to often find the answers for ourselves. We're not always given what we want from the universe. And so, yes, how do you find some sort of resolution? How do you find some way of moving forward? Um, and I think for me, it's about grace, and it's about forgiveness. Or, I mean, that feels trite to say, like, oh, we should forgive and forget, and it's easy to say, but what does that really mean? And I don't think I expect, and I think Mercy would say this, she doesn't expect forgiveness, but some bit of compassion or of letting go, right? And I think Hillary really goes on this journey where she realizes that the anger she holds on to is poisoning herself. We are the ones who suffer when we hold on to these negative feelings. And so I wanted an ending that didn't feel sentimental necessarily and oversimplified of like, so much grace that it felt unrealistic. But I wanted it to contain some level of grace, some level of like the beginning of letting go and the beginning of forgiveness, as the beginning of a new journey for these characters.
Well, speaking of new journeys, Mercy is, of course, by that point pregnant with Hillary's husband's child, David. Um, Mercy's this young woman who blames herself for the disappearance of Gus and has gone through this entire story kind of denying herself happiness, refusing to permit herself the chance to begin life again, which is kind of where Charlie comes in the story. The fact that she's now carrying a child of her own with all these unresolved feelings around the way that she potentially let another person's child down and it led to something terrible happening, that's so poetic and painful and beautiful at the same time. Can I ask what felt right about leaving that character where we leave her, embracing her mother while embracing a new future? That's an interesting thing to note there, given what she is dealing with.
Yeah, it is quite profound because I think that I'm interested to see what people think of this character. I think she's very easy to hate. I mean, she does a lot of terrible things. Um, and I also think she's really fascinating. Even if I don't like her, it's not about liking or not liking, like people are people for various reasons. And she, at the end of the day, I think when we get to the final episode, what I wanted people to recognize, I wanted people to have strong feelings about her, and then I wanted them to recognize that she is a child, and I think we so often forget, um, because this is the world in which we force our children to grow up very quickly, and particularly this character with all of the trauma that she holds from her own mother. Um, she is looked at by her mother as an adult, like, "You need to support me in many ways." Like, her mother has a lot of issues that she hasn't worked through, and I think for Mercy, when she, gets to this point, one, we realize that she, is a child, who just needs her mother, and that's really heartbreaking, and also, I think we worry about how she's gonna break, um, the cycle of trauma. She's going to have her own daughter now, and she has choices to make, and to not repeat the trauma and to let go of things. And so she realizes that she has a responsibility to someone else, to something greater than herself.
That's so interesting you mentioned her, the kind of trauma that she's inherited from her mother, because that's a running theme. Like Hillary also has this kind of really difficult familial background that I think kind of paints a different light on why she's an expat. There's a suggestion that maybe she's run away to a certain degree. We obviously have that fantastic episode, the strand of the episode in the lift. I feel so bad for the poor woman with the lipstick who's in the lift with Hillary and her mum. Um, as I say, this is a running thread. David also has this kind of harrowing background, familial background in terms of his brother who he disabled in an accident. Can you tell me about yeah, what it was about families and the degree to which a lot of these characters do have troubling backdrops in terms of their siblings and their parents, why that was an inviting thing to kind of thread through this story so universally?
I think we all have that to some degree, whether we know it consciously or people have to, you know, go to therapy and discover it at some point in their lives. We all carry um, traumas from our childhood, insecurities, things from our family. Um, and I think, as I was saying earlier, that as we learn about these characters, we almost see them in a different light. And so rather than being the thing that narratively drives forward is not necessarily these external plots that happen, but the character's own revelations or in our revelations of these characters, and it forces us to see them in a different light, whether that's with compassion or more compassion or less compassion, hopefully more, right? Because I think at the end of the day, every person that you meet has an entire story that you don't know, and whether they just, the person who honked at you on the street, whether they had a bad morning or whether they had a bad childhood. And again, it's not to justify people's actions, but I think just to have a bit of understanding and to yeah, hopefully kind of create, more compassion for them.
I think one instance in, I think it's the third episode that kind of captures that in a nutshell is when Margaret's in the supermarket and she's searching for some ingredient to go in her son's volcano. I think it's like maple syrup or something like that.
Corn syrup, very American.
Corn syrup, that's right. Yeah, yeah. You can tell I never built a volcano. Um, the that scene, like it kind of it encapsulates so much about this show because the staff, they can only perceive her by her rudeness, which is valid. She is very rude to them, but we as an audience are privy to the things that are informing that rudeness, and it's such a kind of great distillation about what's so fascinating about expats. There's this multitude of things happening simultaneously, and characters deserve our compassion, but they also deserve our condemnation in well, maybe that's a strong word, but our kind of acknowledgement of their flaws. Can you tell me about finding these small moments? Because as you say, it's not a plot driven show. So much of what drives the show forward are these small little moments.
Yeah, I love that scene so much, and Nicole and I talked about it a lot because she recognized that she was gonna be playing, almost the stereotype of, this white American woman in Hong Kong, um, mistaking, uh a regular guy who's shopping for somebody that works there,
Yeah.
and who doesn't speak the language and who is demanding and feels entitled. Um, and that's a scary thing to take on. And she was incredibly courageous for doing it because I really love that scene because yeah, it's one that was in the book, and I love that, Margaret in all of her consciousness, awareness, right, of I'm not going to be one of those Americans, and we have to be nice to them, and we have to, goes the extra mile to not be that American. Then all of it goes out the window, and she is who she is. but we've all been there also, like in which like something brings out the worst in us. And are we judged for that one moment, or do we hope that people will judge us within a greater context? That's not a question I can answer, right? That's the question that I'm posing. And so um, it was interesting because I was both able to sympathize with, my protagonist, but also I've definitely been the guy in that grocery store, right? Where somebody's like screaming at me. And um I've also been in those situations where I may or may not have pretended that I don't speak English. Just to like uh yeah, so and I love that actor so much. He has this face that is just like not broad in any way, but is incredibly funny in a really grounded way and subtle. And I don't even think he recognizes how funny he is. He just was always looking at me like, "Oh, you think I'm great? Why? I don't know." I really love that scene because it says so much, and also it is a comedic scene. And you're like, who are we laughing at? Are we laughing at the situation? Are we laughing at him, with him, at her? Well, not with her, she's not laughing, but, like, it's got all of these, things, and I just had a really great time shooting it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of laughter, I think the other moment that really floored me was in the morgue when Nicole's character just cannot stop laughing in the kind of worst possible moment to be laughing. And again, speaking of these small moments that kind of feel so well informed, like that feels like something that would happen in a strange way, despite having never really seen it on screen before. Can you tell me about that scene and yeah, the decision crucially to not have it be Gus's body, because it's almost like a worse fate for these characters. And Clark himself says it. He was praying in a way for it to be his son's body in that bag, because it would have given some form of release instead of like the eternal uncertainty that I suppose these characters are going to be burdened with.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted this to be, a reflection of how different people respond to a situation, a tragedy, a loss. And so having him it not be the body and how it provides one person with a source of relief, a sense of relief, and it gives the other person um a total meltdown. And, and it also was a way to swap this husband and wife where one person was melting down and the other person had to carry, um, life and carry the family forward, which is Clark, played by Brian T, who's so sensitive and strong, and you get used to seeing him as sort of and also because he's Asian American, you're like, yeah, of course he's like the good father, right? Like he's like holding it together and he's doing everything he's supposed to do. And Margaret gets to be the total meltdown in the family and totally crazed person and dealing with grief. And there's a privilege in that, right? The person who gets to melt down. Um, and so I wanted to make sure we were able to swap that dynamic and give Clark his moment to melt down and have it be surprising. And yeah, and the fact that for him, he just wants closure. Like and I think um it's said by Pastor Allen in episode 5 where he says, sometimes not having the answer is worse than certainty and knowing that you can then move on. And so yeah, having that handoff where she now kind of is able to trust herself and she's like, I know it's not him. And then to have that validated, and she's like, okay, there's hope. And what carries her on is that hope. And for him, that hope is impossible to live with because it's a lack of closure and just like a constant searching as opposed to being present. Um, and so, yeah, I just um, love that moment. And I love that Nicole and I had a conversation about it because it wasn't written that she was going to laugh. But we talked about it and I was like, I also don't want you to just break down crying. And so she told me about how she reacted when she saw um, her own father's body, when I guess it was in a morgue. Um, and she was like, I responded in a way that surprised even myself. And so I said, well, let's try this. Let's try this and see if it works. And we did a few takes like that. And I was like, we don't need anything else. She's like, are you sure? Are you sure we can do it the straight way where I like don't laugh? And I'm like, like, if we can't make this work, then this scene like isn't even worth having because this is so brilliant. Like this has to work somehow. And I don't want to give another option. Um, because I felt it on set. It's so uncomfortable. And then it makes Clark so uncomfortable and everybody around her so uncomfortable. Like, why is she reacting in this way?
You mentioned the pastor there. There isn't much screen time for some of the male characters in this story, but despite that, you still manage to give them their interiority and Clark's kind of spirituality at odds with Margaret's kind of denial of that and her shutting down of her religious belief, I suppose. That's such a fascinating divide that Gus's disappearance stokes in their relationship. There's a speech that the pastor gives. It's the help in the helicopter speech, and it's such a beautiful monologue, and it seems so resonant to some of the other kind of themes of the show and some of the other things that other characters are experiencing. The pastor in just a brief scene manages to kind of really move the needle on the show at large. Can you tell me about the inclusion of that scene and what he has to say there? Because it feels like something that is applying to characters both within that room and beyond in the story.
Yeah, I think it's ultimately that a speech about hope. And I also really, I myself am not religious in that way. But I grew up going to a church. And so I've always grappled with it, like, because the church and the people and the community gave me so much. And yet I don't subscribe to a lot of the same beliefs. And I really liked uh, this pastor grappling with his own sort of role in the world, and why he does what he does. And I also felt like we don't often get to see people change their like fundamental philosophical religious beliefs. And I thought that was really interesting how a tragedy might change one person. And then what do you do? Like if you're married to somebody and sort of all of the ideologies for which you married them because you were aligned and suddenly they start to shift, do you still love that person? And if you don't, because you no longer recognize them, then did you ever love them in the first place? Or did you just love the fact that they agreed with you? And so again, it's challenging these things and having Margaret and Clark have to contend with it because they are reacting and looking for answers in different places. And so, yeah, it was important that the pastor wasn't coming in to save them in any way. I didn't want somebody coming in and kind of just giving these, because it would feel trite if he was just like, this is what God would say, and you have to have hope. But it was sort of his pursuit of something as well. Like he himself was in pursuit of hope, and I think he leaves that home not knowing if he was of help at all.
Yeah.
And that to me is also really interesting.
This is a big question, and I don't know the degree to which you'll want to answer it, Lulu, so feel free to pass. But why do you think Margaret was unable to board that plane in the final episode? Because as the show ends and we see her striding through Hong Kong, it doesn't feel like she's in the same place that she was, around episode 2 or episode 3, in which like she's still frantically searching for her child and she's keeping that flame alight, that sort of hope alive in herself. It feels like something new, and I was wondering, yeah, the degree to which maybe you're willing to grapple with that question.
I think, one of the questions that drove me to tell the story was these questions around the term expat even, who gets to be an expat? Am I an expat in Hong Kong? But wait, I'm also a Chinese immigrant. I've left this continent to go to America, where I've been a Chinese immigrant my whole life. And now am I an expat? Am I still an immigrant? I'm not an immigrant here. Like, who am I? And um what is the definition of all of these terms? Why do we call people what they are? And what comes with that? What's the baggage that comes with it? Is it just about being white and Western that you get to be called an expat? Because there are a lot of Asian expats in Asia. Is it about wealth? Is it about privilege? And so, in kind of questioning all of these things, I thought a lot about sacrifice. I thought a lot about permanence versus impermanence. And in many ways, Margaret's the privileges that she came into that country with, right? Originally, when she went there, was for her husband's job, and it would be temporary. And she, came with this package of the car and the house and all of that. Um, by the end, when she stays, she's stripped of all of those things. She's now there for a greater reason, for a purpose, and she's had to sacrifice her family in order to be there. And so that was the journey that I wanted her to have. And as a mother, I think she just felt in her heart that this was now her life's purpose. She couldn't abandon the search for him until she knew. And that's devastating, because also we see what that does to her other children. And so you can criticize if she's a good parent or a bad parent for doing that. But this is the choice that she felt that she had to make. And it makes a lot of sense. Like, I've talked to a lot of women who've said, I completely understand her. Like, I would never be able to abandon that search in that way, and just by getting on a plane and feeling like he's still all the way over there, potentially.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful note to end a TV series on. Um, I love the kind of I'm going to butcher the exact phrasing. I'm so sorry, Lulu, but the sort of the mention of like humming to stop being overwhelmed by the silence. That's such a beautiful sentiment. The way that the sort of screen goes to black and we hear the hum. Can you remember like was it fairly early on that you knew that would be your end point? That would be your final, well, not an image, but a lack of an image.
Gosh, I mean, I think I knew that I wanted to end on her walking through the city. It was a very challenging shot to get, and I wanted it to be I wanted there to not have be any edits, to just really be with her, and on this like single take. Um because she becomes, part of the city in many ways. Like, people are in Hong Kong for various reasons, and they stay for various reasons. And so I knew that I wanted her to kind of disappear into a crowd. And but the humming and that entire voiceover didn't come to me until much, much later. Like, in the edit process, it just felt like we needed to close out, because we had done these visual voiceovers throughout the whole episode. And um and I felt like I wanted to still tie Mercy and Margaret somehow. Like, I don't know if these two women are ever going to talk again, see each other again, but somehow they're connected forever. And they're always going to be thinking of each other and how the other one is doing and what the other person is doing. And so I wanted to make sure I carried that sentiment, and that in a way there was this spiritual connection between them, and that they both had to find a way to move on, and that they could allow each other somehow to do that.
And let me just finally ask you this, Lulu. When you've gotten to know characters as intimately as you clearly did when writing Expats with the rest of the writers' room, do you find yourself imagining what happened to them after the credits roll? Like, how do these characters stay with you after you finish a project that you've poured as much of yourself into as you did here?
I mean, I think about it because so many people have like, there's gonna be a season 2, right? I mean, I know it's a limited series, but you're gonna have another season, right? And so I found myself being like, well, what would even be a season 2? And first of all, I don't think so, but I mean, what would it even be? There's something beautiful about like not knowing and leaving it up to the imagination of of each audience member. So yeah, I do think about them, but I think about them not in like an I know kind of way. I think about like it in a way from like I hope, like a like a this is what I hope for them. Like gosh, I hope Mercy is able to overcome um this generational trauma, and I hope she's able to somehow break out of this self-fulfilling prophecy of being cursed, and see herself as being lucky. I hope that her daughter is she's somehow able to pass on the sentiment that you are lucky, because I do believe in those things, that if a child is told they're lucky at a young age, that they become lucky and are lucky, and if you tell them something else, that that's going to be self-fulfilling. And so um yeah, it's actually really beautiful because I think these days we know too much about people. There's no mystery. Everybody, you're like, gosh, I wonder what happened to that person. Oh, there they are on Instagram and Twitter.
Yeah.
And oh, look, this is what happened. This is where they live now. And this is what they do.
And then you have to do that awkward dance when you run into them where you pretend that you don't know those things, like you haven't stalked them.
Exactly. And you're like, do you say congratulations because you know that they just got married last week? Do you not say it because you actually haven't talked in 20 years? And even 20 years ago, you barely even knew them in school, you
Yeah.
know? Um, and so I think it's really wonderful to have characters that you don't know and you just hope that they're doing well. Or maybe sometimes you go, I hope she got what was coming to her if you don't like them, or whatever it is. But yeah.
Well, they'll be in my thoughts for a long time. Lulu, I love this series. I've loved this conversation. I can't thank you enough for coming on Script Apart. We'll have to do this again when you have your disaster movie that's now locked in. That's got to happen. You'll have to come back on the show then.
That's gotta happen. Yes. Which disaster is it gonna be is the question,
All of them.
ability. All of them
Yeah.
at the same time.
Typhoon. Let's throw a cyber disaster in there as well, like some sort of asteroid. Leave no stone unturned.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, I can't thank you enough. This has been so much fun.
It has been. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.